Welcome to the fifth session of the Womansplaining Writer Conversation. Today we have two of the writers with us that have spoken to and written about more urgent issues that face both Pakistan and women across the world and in Pakistan. We have with us first Ms. Ammara Durrani, who is a senior research fellow at Jinnah Institute, but beyond that, she's a public policy professional that has over 20 years of experience in the development sector. She is currently also leading the developing policy unit at the United Nations Development Program. Secondly, we also have with us Ms. Zofeen Ebrahim, who is an award-winning journalist from Pakistan. She is a freelance journalist, but she has been a contributor to Dawn, to The Guardian, to the Thomson Reuters Foundation, and also has been the Pakistan editor for the Third Post. So we're going to be speaking to both writers about various issues, but since there is a little bit of an interlink here with regards to development, I'm going to start with Ms. Ammara Durrani. I'm going to ask you, Ammara, about, so in your chapter, you write about women in development and how women are affected by development. So this is a very broad chapter in that sense, but you talk about specifics in terms of the gender gap index. And since I believe you wrote this chapter in 2019 originally, you mentioned the 2018 gender gap, which at the time for Pakistan, Pakistan was ranked 148 on that scale. Fast forward to 2021, right now, Pakistan has slipped 5 places lower to 153. So I'd like you to speak to that a bit and talk about that, mention the reasons for that perhaps, and also talk about where we can plug the deficit.
Thank you, Zahaid. It's always a pleasure to be with my Jinnah Institute colleagues and, of course, to be participating in this wonderful production of anthological conversations that Jinnah Institute is leading on the recently released Womansplaining publication edited and produced by Senator Zahaid Rehman and also president of the Jinnah Institute. I'm very honored that I was given the opportunity to contribute a chapter in this anthology. You're correct in assessing that I wrote a chapter specifically looking at my own sector where I currently work, which is Pakistan's international development sector. And indeed, since I wrote the chapter, Pakistan's overall ranking in the gender equality index has fallen 2 spaces further, and the report identifies decreased growth, decreased spaces of women, specifically in the economic and political realm. And when the report identifies these 2 spheres as the chief narrowing of space for Pakistani women, that actually correlates to a number of recent developments that we've seen in Pakistan's political economic context, whereby there are significant and growing numbers of women coming out in the public spaces, including public working spaces, and yet the kind of backlash that we are seeing against women's increased participation in the public spaces, specifically in the political domain, and also to some extent in the economic domain, that correlates with the inequality index lower ranking of Pakistan. We've seen that, in 2007, 2008, when Pakistan experienced a restoration of democratic political order, we saw a correlated increase in women's economic and especially political participation. And so for over the next 10 or 12 odd years, with consecutive democratic transitions, we saw those numbers rising, we saw those indicators improving. And yet, over the last 3-4 years, at least certainly that the index captures the lowering of ranking, we've seen a certain shift in the country's political landscape, in the country's economic landscape. We are seeing, technically we are still in an elected democracy, but the nature, direction, and political projection of the current dispensation is not exactly focusing on, it's not exactly a very gender sensitive or a very gendered political dispensation. There's a greater projection and narrativization of politics in standard male masculinity based power contests, where the genderization of our previous democratic gains has become subdued It has become more symbolic. It has more become a question of numbers rather than substance and content and assertion, especially in the power structures that Pakistan currently has, whether in the cabinet, whether in the public offices, or whether economic institutions of this country. So when there is an overall change in the power environment of the country, especially in the political and economic, then you would see the impact and how that acts as a deterrent for all those women who are looking for opportunities to enter into these domains. I mean, I think since in the last elections, we also saw some decline in women's numbers in the parliament. You look at the current cabinet, and the numbers of women in the current cabinet and some key political offices are nowhere near to what we saw in the previous two dispensations. So I think there are some very obvious reversals and retreats in key structural and decision making areas. And I think when you see those retreats, when you see those reversals, they are caught on by global indices. And I would like to point out here, which I've also written about in my chapter, that the politics of data notwithstanding, there's tremendous politics of data also on international indices, on Pakistan's local official statistics. I mean, I looked at the global indices, the gender equality index included, but then I also analyzed Pakistan's official data, collected by Pakistan Bureau of Statistics. And I looked at our treatment, the domestic treatment of data pertaining to women. There are enormous differences of approach, of methodology, of prioritization, which exists between the global indices and how we collect data nationally and locally vis-a-vis women. And the politics that generates has to be accounted for. How the world chooses to see Pakistan, which prisms the world adopts for looking at Pakistan, and how we choose to look at ourselves. Which prisms do we choose to look at ourselves? We are more focused on identifying very specific economic and political sectors, manufacturing, from forestry to fisheries to construction. We are gathering that data, but does that translate into the global equality indices? I'm not too sure about that, because the world looks at the development progression from a very different prism, largely from Western set models, which of course I question vociferously, in my paper. So I think there is this politics of data that needs to be accounted for, but notwithstanding that politics of data, we are seeing increased numbers, no doubt about it, but how qualitatively are they channeled? How qualitatively are they focused and sharpened for empowerment, for game-changing stake in Pakistan's power equation? That I think has suffered significant setback in the last 3-4 years, and we need to seriously think about the reasons for that.
Thank you for that. I'll come to you here, Zofeen. Ammara spoke about one thing that she spoke about that interests me, because it directly relates to your chapter as well, is about how it's not always a numbers game and how sometimes numbers are only symbols. However, with your chapter specifically, I think it is also often a numbers game. And we see this with the clear lack of voices in the climate arena with regards to women. Women writers are not as commonplace as they might be in other fields, or even if they are, their voices are not heard, maybe perhaps, or perceived as well as they would be otherwise. So as a writer in this field, what challenges did you face in both writing this chapter and generally writing about climate? You'll have to unmute yourself.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Zahaid. And I think this is a very interesting, the turn of our conversation has turned interesting. But I would first like to, talk a little bit about my content so that those who haven't read the chapter can get an idea of what I have written about. Also, it is about climate change. But before I start this, I just want to say I love the title of the book. It's absolutely fantastic. And like the book has just given voices to women writers, even in my chapter, in my essay, I have talked about the women who are affected and the experts, women experts who usually, don't get the voice or the platform to talk about their expertise. So coming back to I want to start with the content of my essay, which is climate change and how, but I want to say that it affects everyone, but the impact on men and women is very different. And women, and then studies have shown that women are impacted more and disproportionately more. For example, in Pakistan, we see that when men migrate as a result of climate change, women have to take even more responsibilities, and there's a lot of stress, and this stress is increasing and will increase in time to come. And I talk about how women are uniquely placed to be agents of change. But because they are most impacted by climate change, they must be on the tables where plans and decisions and solutions are being developed, and which they're not. They're missing. They're very much missing, and so we need to bring them on that table. So in my essay, I talk about local heroes who are agents of change, and they're making gender specific and very inclusive decisions for their communities. And specifically in these times of climate crisis, we need to talk about more about these women. And that is what I have tried to do. And we also know that most of the time these women are few. They're very few, obviously, and they're invisible. But for me, what made them stand out was that without education, without economic support, and not much mobility, they exercise incredible agency to do things differently. And that is why they stand out for me. They have a very positive outlook towards life. Their optimism is infectious, and their very constructive attitude, despite all these barriers, is what is fantastic for me. Um, I can go on, but if you have another question, I will. I can talk about. I can give you some examples from my essay. Should I?
Please do, yes.
All right. Okay. So, these women that I have spoken about, they have remained missing and they have remained unheard in all the conversations that take place around climate change and environment. So I talk about, at one point, I talk about women, you know, uh, uh, how they made it possible and livable in a happier homes in a village in Tharparkar when they were tasked to grow a very endangered tree, which is called Google in Sindhi, and through which they could eke out a living. So, they prospered, but they also made the environment, they helped with the environment. And then there was, I talk about how women who traditionally dried persimmons in Swat, when they got a bigger solar dryer, they could scale up and then they turned it into a business. Then they also, then they got together, they formed a collective. And when they started meeting more often, they realized that by talking to each other, they realized they wanted a metal road running across their village. And that should get connected to the highway. So they got that done. And another example is that, which I'll never forget, is when I interviewed young woman called Almas Parveen, and she's a farmer from a village near Multan, and extremely gung ho. And she talked about how she actually fights for equal pay for equal work, and she will never employ child labor on her farm, and she even campaigns for the elimination of child labor. So where do you get these strong women? Why are they remain unheard? It just baffles me. So
It's really interesting that you bring these up, actually, because one of the things that we've seen is that journalism sometimes, it obviously also focuses on the micro, but sometimes it gets lost in the macro, and these stories also get lost as a result. But more importantly, when you're looking at the developing world versus developed world, and specifically speaking to Pakistan, the climate crisis, many would say, is more urgent here than it is in many other countries as well, right? And in reference to that, writers like you that are writing about these stories, their voices are the ones that need to be amplified the most. South Asian women in particular need to take up more space. However, we see that the climate space and other areas of development, I think Ammara would speak to this, and we'll speak to you, Ammara, in a bit about this as well. That spaces get limited, and that often the narrative is dominated by men and even white men. So, what would you say to that? How can South Asian women take up take up more of a platform in that sense?
So, can you hear me? Because your voice broke. You can hear me. Okay. So, Zahaid, I would say that I absolutely agree with you. I concur with you that right now climate movement is led by white men in the West. Those who speak the loudest about the importance of mitigating climate change are white, and they're male. We have Bill Gates, we have John Kerry, we have Al Gore. Only recently, and I'm very, very happy that there's a youth voice in Greta Thunberg. However, these voices are from global north, and it is time that the megaphone changed hands. It would be great to see a different perspective. Hear how women in the south tackle the climate crisis. I would love to hear from, and I'm sure others would, to hear from artists, our authors, our farmers, our fisherwomen, our politicians, women politicians, negotiators, when they're going for these big climate conferences. But I would like to hear women voices. I would like to hear mothers. I would like to hear singers. What do they have to say? Because having a different point of view is good. It shows collective wisdom. It shows leadership, and it's absolutely fundamental to addressing climate change. But I would like to add, Zahaid, that I would like to add here that in climate change in our part of the world is not always straightforward and easy, because when women from the south are bringing about the change, they are also evolving and getting empowered. Their mobility increases, their access to assets increases, and when that happens. When I go to villages, I always hear that those empowered women will always say, Baji, ab to hame zaban mil gayi hai, that I've got the voice. But, theirs is a risky undertaking, and we must never forget that we need to support that also, because they are challenging the status quo. And it does not always go well with the majority.
Thank you for that. You spoke about mobility and access at the end, and Ammara, I'll come to you on that point, because another thing that you speak about in your chapter is about gender parity in general in the workplace, and specifically how in Pakistan in the development sector, it is a little more not equitable, I would say, because we're still some way off from there, but it is closer to that at least. So how would you've spoken about the political and economic sort of gap that exists. So how would you bridge that gap in other sectors as well, economically, in terms of gender parity at the workplace?
Thank you, Zahaid. No, I think the conversation that you and Zofeen have struck on the climate change sector globally and specifically in Pakistan offers a fantastic example of how the political and the economic are converging in this top priority sector. Why? Because this is not just about climate change. It's about the impact of how climatic change is going to have on the lives, livelihoods, and the associated politics of the people of this country. And women are nearly half of that population segment. Their livelihoods, their lives, their politics would also be impacted by the climatic change. Now, for instance, your question is very specific about how we are bridging the economic and the political. Let us just quickly look at the Prime Minister's 10 billion tsunami tree program, which has rightfully received a lot of global acclaim. and recognition for putting, priorities, national priorities in the right domain. I mean, credit where it's due, it has that. But then how much of the program has been extrapolated, structured, and budgeted for the impact on women and their livelihoods and their lives and their communities? Is there a strong gender pillar to the program? Does the Climate Change Ministry, for instance, which is leading that program on behalf of the Prime Minister's government, have a dedicated gender unit or a dedicated gender team, which is looking at these questions of how this, frontline national program, which is ostensibly designed to address Pakistan's not only climatic needs, but also economic needs, and which in fact is being leveraged to position Pakistan internationally in the foreign policy domain, whereby we are now raising fundamental questions about the debt inequality in the world. The inequalities between heavily debted countries like Pakistan, whose carbon footprint is minimalist, who are not responsible for the climate emergency of the world, and yet they are severely burdened by the debt. And then the heavily carbon producing countries, which are not burdened necessarily by the debt burden. And so Pakistan's whole international relations narrative of using climate change to change the power politics faced by countries like Pakistan is also very interesting. But then where is the gender dimension in this, I would call, very creative discourse? It's a very empowering, fresh discourse for Pakistan. Climate change sector offers a certain freshness, a lot of opportunity and an inspiration for women to enter into the sector and claim their space in terms of political power, in terms of structural power, in terms of economic opportunity, not just at community level livelihoods, affected by climate change, but also in the power structures who are negotiating with the international, development partners and lending agencies on climate finance institutions. Where are the women on the table? How are they addressing the gender questions? Is the Pakistani state machinery dedicating spaces and human resource and budgets for women to address these questions? This is just one standard example of how shifting Pakistani economic model. Pakistan's economy is transitioning, let's face it. It is transitioning from a traditional agrarian rural economy to a more urbanized, more industrialized, more, sectoralized economy. Are we, in addition to this, are we aligning our gender portfolio to the shifting economic models of the country? Climate change sector offers a fantastic case study, in my view. It offers a fantastic opportunity, fantastic promise, but like all other sectors, we are not, placing women at its heart. I mean, and this is closely tied to this whole momentum for placing infrastructure development, the comeback of big time infrastructure development in Pakistan and the region, represented by CPEC. Where are the women in the CPEC conversations? Where is the gender budgeting in CPEC conversations? All the major, fantastic, projects that we're rolling out, we're planning, how gendered are those planning, models? Another example is that we're looking at, I mean, it's very interesting that we are now seeing a conversation of diversifying Pakistan's economy from a traditionally brown economy, again, agrarian, to blue economy, coastal economies, leveraging our coastal capitals, human as well as natural resources, to green economy, again, the 10 billion tsunami tree project type prototypes. So then if we are going to diversify our economic base between brown, green, and blue, how much of these colored economies are gendered? Where are the women in these conversations? Prime Minister's Kamyab Jawan program, for instance, has rightly dedicated some resources to be doled out for fishing communities on Pakistan's coastal regions in Balochistan and Sindh. Rightly so, though those are the most marginalized communities of this country. And in fact, the women in the fishing villages of Pakistan in both Sindh and Balochistan are some of the most vulnerable and marginalized, and yet most productive women of this country. They form mass cohorts in the informal economic labor force participation of women in this country, which unfortunately remains below 25%. I mean, our female labor force participation remains below 25%, which is even less in a number of several African countries and other East Asian countries. It's not as if women are not working. Women are working. You know, the fishing communities in Sindh and Balochistan are a classic example. But then how are they factored in the economic survey of Pakistan, which offers as a policy-making tool? If the Prime Minister's Kamyab Jawan program is providing loans and resources to the fishing communities of Sindh and Balochistan for their empowerment, rightfully so, how much of those resources are gendered? How are they tailored to the women who are cleaning shrimps and fishes and who are really forming the backbone of Pakistan's fishing industry, for instance? So I think these are some of the new emerging questions in how the economics is changing in Pakistan and the region, how that also impacts the direction of politics and the decision-making, diversification and division of resources. How are we distributing national resources to the communities at large and specific communities? It goes at the heart of that question. There is a lot of conversation about reviving the welfare state model. Okay, fantastic. We do see some new legislation which has come out under the incumbent government for giving more rights to women on property, on access to justice. Fantastic. I mean, I think these are long awaited measures where you strike at the heart of the power balance, the gender power balance in the country. But then the distribution of resources through these flagship programs, which are seeking to change the economic model, make it more inclusive, I think those really, really need to be gendered. And I think the infrastructure sector and the climate change sector and development, by the way, goes at the heart of these sectors. These offer very clear challenges and yet opportunities and promise to change the gender game in Pakistan.
Thank you for that. I'm conscious of the fact that we're running a little short of time, so I'm just going to give you the last questions and we can just have a quick word on each of them. Zofeen, from you, I'd like to ask, so you speak about the change that women are having within their own communities and the multiplier that this has in that community. But since Ammara spoke about the participation and the undocumented participation of women in all economic matters, and that goes for the climate sector as well, how can we make this change that women are making be counted for more, be A, accounted, and B, then be multiplied as a result as well?
Thank you, Zahaid. I think that I'm so happy that Ammara has, talked at length about climate change and climate issues. Thanks, Ammara. So I think first and foremost, we should not be afraid of diversity and inclusion. It will only enrich our decision making if we look at climate science through that lens. Also, we need to understand the consequences of not changing our attitudes. There are very, very serious consequences. These are existential consequences. And I think that we haven't really kind of worked that out among ourselves. We do not understand the crisis as well as we should. So, but what should we do? I think the best thing that we can do and the strongest thing that we can do for the climate is educating our women. We need to ensure that more women engage in STEM subjects, which right now is dominated by male students. We also need to empower women to come to decision-making tables. That's very important. And that is only possible when there are more women in boardrooms and at high-level positions in institutions. So when you get when you get women there, you will realize that the decisions are wiser and long term. And I'm not saying that men can't do that. Of course, men do this also, but there is a tendency for women to be more collaborative, and they tend to think much long term. And as Ammara pointed out, I would agree that it frankly makes little sense not to include the 50% of our human potential. So it is time that we think very, very carefully, and we need to, be more inclusive, be more generous, including women in every field, not just climate change, but in every field. Why not? They have the potential. They've shown it in these bits and pockets that we've talked about, and we always find that when we go, around Pakistan.
Thank you. That response made me smile a bit, because that's actually the exact question that I was going to bring up to Ammara as well, with regards to representation in STEM subjects and a seat at the policy making table, so to speak. And we've seen that when that has happened, women have made a much bigger difference with regards to, for example, legislative processes within parliament than compared to the men that are there, that have been there historically. So Ammara, how would you see this as, how do we bring more women into STEM? Because this is not a something that happens immediately. This is a long-term process. So how do we consolidate the gains that we make, and how do we keep continuing on this path to including more women?
Thank you, Zahaid. The answer to your big question is not very hard. Full disclaimer, it's not a difficult answer. It is really about very conscious thinking and very conscious decisions, making very clear and conscious choices of inclusion. I really like what Zofeen said about how are we thinking? What's the thinking model that we're bringing to the table? If we want to continue thinking about business as usual, then forget about change. But if we are committed to refreshing our thinking model, going back to the drawing board, I literally wrote this in my paper. We need to go back to the drawing board, come up with new theoretical paradigms. The answers are not very different. When you are doing recruitment, for instance, for any public or private position, how gendered is your approach? How many shortlists of the shortlists that you have, I'm just giving you a very basic example of how the gains are literally, converted into numbers and qualitative change. When you're shortlisting for positions, how many of the shortlists are women? Amongst the shortlisted, how many are fresh graduates or experienced? Among the shortlists, who are the sectoral experts? If you see a dearth of numbers, go the extra mile and headhunt. Refuse and stop recruitment processes which are not bringing enough women into the shortlist. Refuse and stop the recruitment processes which are not bringing enough competent, capable, and sector specialist women into the game. Just one example. And then when you're drawing up organizational budgets, for instance, how many of the resources are you dedicating to quarterly or biannual or annual trainings and capacity building of your women staff, or even male staff for sensitization and gender trainings? How much of your budget is dedicated to capacity building of your human resource to think differently, to think pro-women, to think of women as development partners? How many of your institutional decisions are structured around the thought of creating a workspace which is an equalizer for both men and women, which is not discriminatory, which actively, structurally, consciously brings about everyday, choices of inclusion and empowerment for your women staffers, your women beneficiaries, your women target communities, from communications to development projects to programs to distribution of resources, all those questions. Like if I work 8 hours a day, I work much more in every day. But theoretically speaking, if I work 8 hours a day, at least 6 hours of that work goes into very conscious choices that go into my everyday work. if I'm producing a publication, if I'm designing a project, if I'm doing recruitments, if I'm doing administrative planning, gender questions are every step of the way, because that's life. Life is about men and women. That is life. That is our reality. Lived reality within the office, outside the office. How can you assume that you're not going to make gendered choices in these fundamental questions and issues of human development? If you're going to make conscious choices, make your thought process sharpened, focused, attuned to the need to genderize decision making and choice making, then you can not only preserve the gains, Zahaid, that you asked about, but also incrementally increase them. But if your thought process is restricted, it's business as usual, you want to do business like, sorry to say, uncles, then the game is not going to change.
Thank you. Thank you both, Ammara and Zofeen, for that excellent conversation. We ran a little short of time, but that's perfectly fine. One last word. I would like everyone in the audience to please go take a look at the book. Both Zofeen and Ammara have excellent chapters within. But we also have many other seminal women that have written for this book. The anthology has been edited by Senator Zahaid Rehman. It looks like this. It's available on all major bookstores in Pakistan. There you go. It's available on the Folio Books website as well, on the Liberty Books website, and it's available on Amazon for our international audience members. Thank you again, both of you. Hope to speak to you again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.